Welcome again to our next video. We're going to go ahead and build out our delete functionality in this lesson. So this is, you should see the process by now, right? We literally drag over the resources we need. We need another lambda function, and we're going to call this lambda function delete URL. And let's just keep the same folder structure. Python 3.9, let's change the architecture to ARM64. And we're gonna keep this as, and we're gonna keep the same naming convention. Delete URL dot handler, and that's about it. We keep pretty much all the defaults from here. The permissions will be the same. In fact, once we connect our lambda function to DynamoDB, we should get the environment variables along with the permissions attached. So let's go ahead and connect that. And if we open this up, we should see reference to our table and the environment variable, table name, and we're on. And that's it. So let's go ahead and write our code. And before we leave, we do need to connect the API endpoint. So we need a third API endpoint. This one would be a little different. Actually, let's go ahead and build out this one. So this one, let's add a route. And this will be a delete. And we're going to say delete URL. And we're going to use path parameter. So when someone requests a delete, we want to accept a value for the ID of the record. And there's a few ways to do this. One way is to use query string. The next way is to use a path parameter, which I think is a lot more cleaner approach. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to just wrap the ID and curly braces. So it should be delete slash the ID that we'll look for. So let's go ahead and save and connect this. That should update our template. Of course, if we look from Visual Studio Code or from the template itself, we should see the delete URL. So let's jump over to Visual Studio. And again, this is something maybe by the time you're watching this doesn't happen, but the moment you create your own folder, somehow the application composer doesn't know how to remove the old one, so it keeps it there, and you're forced to delete this manually. Not a big deal, but something to keep an eye on. So let's open up this handler, and we're going to keep the structure a lot similar to before. We're going to need some of the very same things. So you're probably starting to see some repetition here. We need JSON. We need Bodo tree. And we probably need import OS as well, since we'll be using the very same environment variables. Let's create table name. We'll get this from our environment. And it should be, I'm just going to copy over that name. And it should be URL short table name. And we need a DynamoDB resource. This can be named anything, right? Just for simplistic process, we're going to keep the naming pretty consistent across. DynamoDB. And we also need a table to map to the resource. So let's do DynamoDB, that table. Should be caps. And passing our table name. So those are pretty much the three main things we need to start talking to our resources. So now we're just going to go into our delete functionality. Let's also clear this, so it's a lot more easier. Now we want to get the ID, right? So let's say record ID, and we're going to get this from the event. Now earlier when we created earlier when we set up the resources in Composer, we did somewhat of this type of path, delete slash and the ID of the resource. And this ID is a path parameter, so we need to grab that ID. So we're going to say event and path parameter. This is a built-in functionality. And the name of the path parameter, which is ID. And in fact, if we open up our template, we should see ID. And again, you want whatever name you give to this variable, that's what we'll be grabbing from the event. Now that we have our path parameter, we can probably wrap the delete functionality in some try-catch block. Also, just for so within a try block, we'll probably put all the functionality. In fact, let's move the event record ID extraction as well, because that can fail if we send a request. And let's go straight into delete or matching ID. And this is a table, and we're going to call it delete item and pass in the key. So let's just collapse that a bit. This is key as in capital K E Y, and we want to pass that matching ID and the record ID. So that's pretty much how easy it is to delete records in DynamoDB, right? And we just want to return something back to our API. Some status code with a success and a message. You can also pass some errors as well. That is not required. Content type. Application.json. And let's just make sure we have this comment above. Now, since this is a try, we need to return some message if this fail as well, right? So we need an exception. So let's accept. And typically in this case, we can actually grab a key error, which would probably be the most likely exception that will be triggered, and we can return a message. We just grab this and change the status code. And let's update the message as well. So we have our try catch block, and this is a very simple code. We can probably clean this up some more, but this should be enough to go ahead and deploy and test. So let's save this, and I'm going to do a SAM build and a deploy. And since we have our SAML config at SAML, we shouldn't have to enter some of these information again, for the exception of the authentication question, which will always be present until we automate this. Everything else is default. Check our cloud formation, and this is still being updated. And let me clear this out, but we should see, right, a new delete URL. So let's actually test this in Postman. And I'm just gonna copy this URL. This is a delete, and this should be delete URL. Now remember we did path parameter, so this works a little different from query string, so we just need to pass in the ID of a record. So let's run our get URLs. And now I remember we edit this not to show ID. So let's go over to our table. And you can find, if you click on the CloudFormation stack itself, right, you can find the actual resources. So we're just going to click on our table, export table items, and let's copy this. Now this does show a flaw in our system, right? Think of this in the future of you probably have a web front end for this and you want to delete a record. So we do need to return our ID. And I guess if you are building your own UI, you just not make it visible. But we do need a way to uniquely identify records. So let's copy this. And let's pass this in. And this should be all we need to delete a record. And there we have an error. So let's try to debug this. Let's open up our delete function. We're going to go over to monitor and view cloud watch logs. And we should see that first request being logged. Here we go. So usually when you see an error like this where no module name, and we can double check our name and convention, that is fine, right? Just delete URL handler. And let's check our Lambda function again. Actually, if we scroll all the way down, name matches. However, if we look here, it's in handler. So we needed to update this in our code. So if we go back to our code, and that's one way of making sure we're actually consistent. So we're naming the file to match the name on the left of the handler. So we need to change this to delete URL. Now, again, we went over this earlier in the video. The naming convention is pretty much up to you, right? If you want to keep handler, we could have done that as well. This is just to show you some flexibility around naming your files. So let's save this. And we're going to build again. And let's deploy. Okay, we're done. So let's go back, and if we check the console, let me just refresh this. Our Lambda function name should have gotten updated. That's actually good. And if we go back to our API, let's try this again. And we see successfully delete record. So let's grab this. All right, and if we check our DynamoDB tables, we should see one item. There we go. So not only that, if we do a get, this is showing 2 items, we should see 1. Now this worked, while we did see a flaw in our get, right? We thought it was good to hide the ID, and for the sake of this demo, we need to have the ID, so it just makes it easier. And when we do a front end and you want to actually delete these things, it will be easy to grab the unique items. So let's update that in our code as well, which should be very simple. So again, the field is ID. And if we open back our get URL, we were uniquely identifying those fields. So let's just add ID item.id. Let's save this, and I'll do a deployment again. Let me save this configuration. And so the next time we perform a get query, we should see the ID, since we needed an easier way to grab the IDs moving forward. And let's try our get query. And there we go. So this wraps up our create, get, and delete. In the next video, we'll start making changes to our API gateway. We'll switch from REST to HTTP, and then we can do the core of this application, which is the URL redirect. Thanks for watching.